Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and this bonus show we have for you this Sunday. Normally, my shows start on Monday, but we have an extra one for you today. So I'm going to make a sort of public announcement right now because it's occurred to me that since my guest was first on the channel, I was kind of lowly, a few hundred of you watching occasionally if I was lucky. And now it's, 25,000 plus subscribers and things are happening for us. But I want to publicly thank some of those people right at the beginning who supported me when it was just a crazy idea and I didn't have a very good camera and I didn't know what I was doing and I was making it up as I go along. And so my guest today is one of those people who supported me right at the beginning. So Alex Kershaw is back. I think it's his fourth visit, and this time he's talking about his forthcoming book, Against All Odds, that's out for pre-order right now, and it's set mostly in Italy, but also where the American 3rd Division were before and after, and some of their greatest heroes. So I'm going to bring Alex into the show now. Good evening, Alex. How are you today?
I'm good, thanks. How are you, mate? It's great to see you.
I'm all right. So I don't know how many books is this? You're well over a dozen now, isn't it? Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's 12. Yeah. Too many.
So too many. But you've tackled spies. You've tackled the D-Day landings. You've written about individuals. You've written about campaigns. You've gone under the sea with submarines. What is it that you're looking for when you're thinking about a new book? It's always the story with you. It's not that you've got a loyalty to a particular army or campaign or even war. It's got to be story led. So what are you looking for? How do you start the process?
That's a great question. I am really looking for a story that I'm going to enjoy telling and that hopefully readers will enjoy. With this book, Against All Odds, I became fascinated by Medal of Honor recipients in World War II, and I don't know, I went out to Oregon to meet a guy called Bob Maxwell, just on a whim. I thought there might be something in the 3rd Division just by doing basic Wikipedia research. They were in longest in combat in World War II in Europe. And notably had the largest number of Medal of Honor recipients, I think 36 during the war, and there have been 4 awards subsequently. And then when you think that there were, I think 434, there's going to be fact checkers out there, but I think it's about, let's just say around 440 odd Medal of Honor recipients from World War II. To get almost a tenth of that number from one division, by the end of the European conflict, there were 90 odd US divisions fighting in Europe, and to have one division, the 3rd Division, to receive almost a tenth of all the medals of honors that were awarded in World War II was just something that really interested me. I was like, what the hell was going on there? And the clear answer is that why they had so many medals was because they spent so long in combat. I mean, the 3rd Division fought longer than anybody else and suffered very, very high casualties from North Africa all the way to Berchtesgaden. There's a map there that can show you that very long odyssey. So that was a simple reason. I went out to Oregon to see a guy called Bob Maxwell, who at the time was 98, and this was a couple of years ago. And Bob Maxwell was one of only 4 living Medal of Honor recipients from World War II at the time. And he was the oldest, he was 98. And he was in the 3rd ID, and received the Medal of Honor for actions in Besançon in September of 1944. Really super religious guy, wonderful, wonderful guy. And I interviewed him and just became fascinated by his story and the story of the 3rd ID and the notion of what it meant to receive the Medal of Honor, and also the weight of that medal for the rest of those guys' lives, what it meant to them to be a recipient. And Bob Maxwell, without going on too long, said that he put the medal around his neck and said, a lot of my life this has weighed very heavy indeed.
And that's what's interesting about that division, is because you have multiple awards, you can kind of use it as a test sample in a way of what, as you said there, earning that medal does to people. Because I remember talking to someone on a tour a few years ago who worked for the War Department or something, and he was saying how now they almost, before giving people a medal, they look at whether or not that person can deal with it psychologically because of this burden. They kind of have a think about, is that person going to be able to deal with it? Oh, I think I seem to have lost Alex for a second. You still there, Alex? Oh, I think we've temporarily lost Alex. I'll keep on talking on my own and we'll come back in a minute. It happens sometimes, folks. I guess he'll be back in a second. And yeah, we've temporarily lost Alex. We'll go anyway. I'll carry on talking. So this, yeah, I'll carry on talking. Then I'll bring Alex back in. It happens sometimes, internet connections, but yeah, the burden of responsibility to give anyone some kind of medal like that is enormous, and it's why, in a way, it's not preferable to be killed when you're getting a medal like the Victoria Cross or the Medal of Honor. But if you receive it posthumously, at least you're not then going back and everyone expecting you to be the hero. I mean, I've met one Medal of Honor recipient in my time, Walt Ehlers in Normandy, and he was saying how difficult it was to people expect you to be a hero. Well, we lost you there. We come back again. Can you hear me, Alex?
That,
no worries.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, got you. Yeah, I was just saying about this idea that, you know, that it's a burden, is it? You know, and how they now look at whether or not someone can deal with the pressure of being referred to forever and ever as a hero. I mean, I was just saying to the viewers, I met Walt Ehlers, who was awarded it for Normandy, just very briefly about 10 years ago, and he was saying he knew that everything he would ever do in his life ever again, if it made the newspapers, it would say Walt Ehlers, Medal of Honor recipient, crashes his car. Walt Ehlers, Medal of Honor recipient, divorces. And it would always be the thing, that the label that he's given. And that's a huge responsibility, isn't it? So what, you know, with the third division, what do you think was the single ingredient, apart from the fact they saw a lot of combat? Was there a single ingredient? Was it leadership? Was it something about the ethic within that unit, about going above and beyond? What's your gut feeling?
Well, they were very well led. They had one of the finest combat commanders of World War II in Lucian Truscott. So yeah, very well led. But I think it's basically simple. They just saw a hell of a lot of very intense combat. They were in some very, very violent battles. You know, from North Africa was a bit of a cakewalk for the third ID. They landed in Operation Torch, but Sicily, third ID, crossing from southern Sicily to the northern coast was a hell of a trek. And then you had Salerno and the terrible attrition of climbing up those mountains as you pushed north through Italy. One of the guys I write about, Maurice, Britt, received the Medal of Honor for actions in November of 1943. And then you had Anzio. So you had these are extraordinarily bloody battles of attrition. Then you go into southern France, Operation Dragoon. You go to the Colmar Pocket, which, you know, I know that you've done shows on the Colmar Pocket, but a lot of people don't really understand just how bitter that fighting was. All the headlines go to the Battle of the Bulge, but in the Colmar Pocket in January and February of 1945, those were probably, if anything, worse conditions to be fighting in. It was in the Colmar Pocket that two of the four guys I write about from the third ID, they performed actions where they received the Medal of Honor. Keith Ware, who was a battalion commander, and Audie Murphy, obviously at Holtzfear. And then they move on, they cross the Rhine, and then they're into street fighting in Nuremberg. And not a lot of people know that it was the third ID, not the Screaming Eagles, not the Band of Brothers, that actually had the great honor of liberating Berchtesgaden right at the end of the war. So that's a heck of a trek. It's a heck of an odyssey, and a hell of a lot of fighting and battles. And that's why you had such high casualties, and that's why I believe you had such a large number of Medal of Honor recipients, because the guys that received those medals there were so many men fighting so hard that they deserved them because of the sheer amount of violence and combat they had to endure.
No, definitely. And well, let's go through some of these guys individually. Obviously, folks, we're going to be giving a very condensed version of the story today because the full story is going to be in the book, which is available. And the links I always mention are in the description below. So there are links to a bookstore, but you can also buy it at whatever internet reader or real bookshop you want to go and find it in. It'll be available very soon. So March and April, depending on whether you're ordering Kindle or real books, and depending on which country you're in. But let's go back to, well, let's talk about Maurice Britt for a second, Alex. But I want to talk about the fact that, again, the writing process, because with a Medal of Honor recipient, you've obviously got that citation is your starting point. But citations are not necessarily talking about the action for people who were in the action. They're talking about the action in a sense for the public consumption back home. They're considering kind of word length and how this will work in the media back there. So you've got to go back to the morning report and what the other people about in these actions said, and how when you're researching, how different is the Medal of Honor citation to when you're actually uncovering the action? Is it kind of a condensed version, or is it often more of a PR version? How do you kind of tally up the two?
Well, if you look at a lot of Medal of Honor citations, they tend to read the same in some ways. You know, it's going far beyond what's normally expected, and there's probably, you know, for each of these guys it was maybe 2 paragraphs at most. And it's very important to remember that at the time you had to have eyewitness reports. You had to have people recommend you, and then you had to have not just one eyewitness, but you had to have 2, 3, sometimes were more eyewitness reports, because this is given by Congress. It's a very formal process, and they didn't want to make any mistakes. You look at the recommendations, and then you look at the actual citations. They're very boring. You wouldn't have any. I mean, they, you know, killed this many people, took out 8 tanks, 4 machine guns, etc. It's very numbers based, very statistical. But there's no feeling for what it was actually like to perform the act. There's no description of the circumstances beyond the hours or the few moments where the medal, you know, was won. So it's very dry, and it doesn't really describe really anything that can bring the character to life and bring the action to life in terms of, you know, a bigger picture and a more dramatic picture. So with Britt, for example, you're seeing him there. He became something of a star in America because he came home after his arm was blown off at Anzio in early 1944, and he became the first American to receive every medal for valor in World War II. Now, in World War I, there weren't as many medals that you could win, so there were actually guys in World War I that did actually receive every medal that you could possibly get. But Britt in World War II was the first American to get Bronze Star, Silver Star, DSC, and Medal of Honor, which made him a big deal. And he willingly went along with the propaganda campaign built around him. He did what all those guys did that came back and were Medal of Honor recipients. He did his best to support the war effort. That's a picture there of him receiving the medal. I think that's the 5th of June, 1944, in the Razorback Stadium at the University of Arkansas, where he was a star football player before the war. He actually played for the Detroit Lions too. So to answer your question, yeah, if you just look at the citation, you got no idea what these guys were really doing or what they went through. You know, the cost to them emotionally, how long they'd been in combat before they received the medal. You know, what happened after they received the medal. You know, it's a snapshot of sometimes just a very short period of time when some of these guys, for example, Audie Murphy, you know, he was on the line. He arrived in Sicily in 1943, July 1943, and was in Germany, received the medal in an official ceremony on the 15th of June 1945. He was still just 20 years old. So he's spent an awful long time killing and seeing a lot of his good buddies die. That's a lovely picture of him there. So if you just look at the citation for his his Medal of Honor, it describes a few hours on one day, and it gives you no idea of what had come before or what came after.
Yeah.
So yeah, my driving to dramatize their actions and to put them in the context of a much longer campaign and to humanize them as much as possible.
And also, of course, to reflect on all the soldiers around them, because the Medal of Honor is an individual award. Of course it is. And it's recognizing that sole act of bravery by an individual. But that individual, at the moment he's receiving that medal, there is a structure of other support troops around him. There's his platoon, his company, the tanks, the air power around him, the mortars, the artillery. And, you know, with your work on, you know, about the D-Day, the first men on D-Day, you're always you single out these individuals, but then you put into the context of that Audie Murphy is nothing without people around him. He can't do what he is doing without those people just giving and sometimes covering fire or being in the same situation, giving him the confidence to do these things. So that's an obviously important aspect to you, is bringing in the other people. And when you know, in your interviews or looking at the archives of the people who were in these actions, if you were Joe Schmo platoon member in Audie Murphy's platoon, do you think these people felt that the medal was also a reflection of their unit's achievements as well as it being individuals?
To some extent, although, you know, when you look at the guys that didn't die in the process of receiving the medal, and I think almost 2/3 of the medals from World War II were given posthumously. You know, in my research, people were just overawed by what if they were lucky enough to see it, they were overawed by these actions. They were, you know, they were extremely appreciative of the courage and the dynamism and the intrepid actions that, in Audie Murphy's case, when he, you know, when he gained the Medal of Honor, his actions saved certainly saved his company and perhaps a battalion. And the commanding officer that wrote up the recommendation, Keith Ware, who's actually ironically one of the characters in my book, you know, he said that you know, if it hadn't been for Murphy, then a hell of a lot of guys would have been captured or killed or wounded. So I think that, to answer your question, Maurice Britt, coming back to Maurice Britt, he said that, you know, he was very lucky to live. And he was lucky to receive the medal because there were a lot of guys that he knew that had died that their actions hadn't been witnessed. And let's go back to Omaha Beach. You know, we've had this debate before about the number of guys that should have received the Medal of Honor where no one saw them do what they did. And that's, there's probably, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of guys that had people witness what they did in World War II would have received the Medal of Honor. So, you know, it goes back to this idea of the weight of the medal, because those who received it to this day, you know, it's a great honor, obviously, but it also reminds them of, you know, the worst days of their life or the worst day of their life when they went through extreme trauma. And every one of the guys that I write about felt that they somehow didn't deserve it. Didn't deserve to be singled out, because there were so many other men that they'd seen perform incredible actions who should have received the medal as well. They just happened to have been seen doing something extraordinary, and people were around to give eyewitness reports while officers were compiling the recommendation for the medal. I should add that if you look through the 3rd Division records, in fact, any records for combat units, divisions in World War II, you'll notice that key actions, key days, key turning points in certain battles, guys were recognized for the significance of their contribution to the outcome of that day's combat. You know, for example, breaking out from Anzio, 26th of May, 1944. You know, a couple of guys from the 3rd ID received Medal of Honors for actions on that day, and that day was an extremely important day in the history of the 3rd Division and in terms of the outcome of the Battle of Anzio, because it was the first day that we started to break out, and the 3rd ID, I believe, suffered over 800 fatalities on that just that one day, which is the largest number of fatalities from any US infantry division on any one day in World War II. So it's the context in which these actions were performed that also matters. People wanted to recognize the individual contributions of certain heroes on really important days and in very important actions. So you'll see that continuity. So, there are several battles where why there was more focus on individuals that perform those acts on those days.
No, and obviously the recurring theme is possibly guilt. You said guilt of survival, guilt of then receiving an award that perhaps you think someone else should have received. I mean, and we're talking about the people obviously who receive it who live, because as you said there, 2/3 or more of those who receive the medal don't live to receive it, but the burden on those who do live. And so when again with the writing process, you're trying to make these stories alive and bring the characters forth so that people can understand them. But when you get into the post-war years, I mean, everybody knows Audie Murphy's story. He goes from World War II hero to movie star to decline. I mean, a 20-year battle with PTSD is what we would label it today. But when you're writing about them in the sense of World War II, how far do you think you can go in terms of looking at how the burden unfolds? Oh, we seem to have lost Alex again there. Okay, we've lost Alex again there. This happens sometimes, folks. I will keep on talking. If you just while we're waiting for Alex to come back, folks, Naval Battles Week starts tomorrow on Monday. So we've got some great shows coming up. You're coming your way. Brian E. Walter is on with us tomorrow, talking about the Battle of the Mediterranean, the vital Mediterranean battle that is often overlooked by perhaps the Atlantic goings on. So he'll be on tomorrow. Then on Tuesday, we've got more shows. We've got one show about the USS Tide. We've got one, maybe an extra one I'm scheduling towards the end of the week about the Italian Navy. We'll see how it goes. If you are new to the channel, please don't forget to click subscribe. Don't forget to like the shows that you're watching. Don't forget to tell other people what we're doing. Well, Alex seems to be back again now. The internet is across the Atlantic is being a bit weird today, but you're back, Alex. So can you hear me?
Yeah, definitely. Sorry about that. For some reason it keeps cutting out.
Yeah, no worries. So with this idea about the burden. So you're trying to make a story that people want to read. You want to celebrate what these individuals did as part of the unit, but you also want to see or try and explain to people the toll on them personally after the war. So how do you strike that balance? You don't want to be kind of grubby talking about how the difficulties after the war, but at the same time, it is an important part of the fact that these people do carry these burdens. So how do you approach that aspect?
Well, I can just go through some of the characters. Britt, that you see there, had a remarkably healthy war and post-war life. He ended up becoming lieutenant governor of Arkansas, but he, he'd lost his arm and had dozens and dozens of very bad shrapnel wounds, and in fact he died in surgery because of a complication of an old wound. That's a lovely picture of him in hospital in Georgia in May 1944. So he got really banged up. But what was incredible about him was that he had no bitterness about losing his arm, even though that meant his NFL career was over. It's a great, that age was a terrible blow, but he felt no bitterness. I don't know whether he, mentally dealt with the scars. I don't know about that aspect of it, but it always, from the people I talked to about him, he was very positive, very, very buoyant, very effervescent character. Just, didn't seem to have any kind of psychological scars at all from the war. I'm sure there were some. I'm sure he did suffer from PTSD. It would be impossible not for him to to have been affected by it profoundly, given what he went through. But he put a very brave face on it and seemed to thrive after the war. Audie Murphy, you talked about, yeah, he was severely affected by PTSD, and yet remarkably, had a very productive life. I mean, was scarred deeply by the loss of so many of his friends. Was rather an erratic character, was prone to outbursts of violence, wasn't a drinker, heavy gambler, and he died in a plane crash, age 46. But he again, given what he'd been through, the sheer level of violence and trauma, was wounded twice. Half of his buttock was cut away after he was shot by a sniper in late 1944. So given the sheer amount of extreme violence and trauma that he experienced, the fact that he didn't commit suicide or end up as a homeless drunk was quite extraordinary. He was terribly affected by it, and I think one of the things that I admire about all of these guys that I write about is that they were profoundly hurt and damaged by what they'd been through, and yet their real heroism, yes, it was on the battlefield, but I think there was a even greater heroism, which was how they dealt with coming home and how they tried to adapt and how they led all of them, really productive lives. I mean, Murphy starred in many movies. He was very active in terms of supporting the military. He was, very generous in many ways and to all sorts of causes, and was very, very productive. I mean, he made over 30 movies, including, To Hell and Back, which was the movie of his own autobiography. So you can't say that the guy wasn't creative or productive or didn't bring a lot of joy to people's lives, even though inside he was in a lot of pain and turmoil. So point being is that these guys' resilience, it showed on the battlefield, and it was similar when they came home. There was a core to them, there was a steel to them that enabled them to deal with things that are just unimaginable to us, that we, I don't think I could have dealt with anything that these guys went through.
And that is, I guess, because these individuals received the Medal of Honor, there was therefore that interest in their lives. I mean, Audie Murphy, the exception being a Hollywood movie star, but the others, that they are the kind of people that people went and interviewed a few years later. They did the war bonds drives. If the town they lived at was having some kind of commemorative event, they would be the ones who go out there. So therefore, as a researcher, you have a body of work of interviews with these individuals over a number of years. And as the tragedy is, we know, is that so many men came back from World War II, and women, and never spoke about it at all for the rest of their lives. So if you're trying to understand the experience of everybody who went to war, because of the information about the Medal of Honor recipients, they can kind of work as a sample of everybody's experience, because of this history of them being talked about. I mean, essentially, it isn't even that the press would always be following their careers, and so you said that you can chart Audie Murphy's post-war life, you can chart other lives, but so many people who didn't receive medals, they just drop off the radar after 1945.
Yeah, and one of the things about one of the motivations for this book was I singled out 4 guys, and actually I mentioned quite a few others that received the Medal of Honor during the narrative. But my point was that by following these 4 characters, you actually follow thousands and thousands and thousands of other men in the 3rd Division, and you actually have a broader picture, because the 3rd ID went from the very beginning, November 1942, right to the end. My idea was to tell the story of every infantryman in some ways, to tell the story of the liberation of Western Europe by Americans in World War II. The 3rd ID was just a really equal in that. So I wanted to humanize that story even more by focusing on 4 exceptional individuals. But there were many exceptional individuals. But I wanted to personalize it and humanize it and give it a lot of detail and drama. And because these guys, their actions were covered at the time pretty extensively, and they came home and were interviewed. Some more than others. I was able to build up a more detailed, more fine-tuned, more granular picture of what it was like to be in these moments of extreme, intense violence and courage, and what courage really boiled down to in many cases during the war, which was an interesting question. What is courage, and what made these men do what they did? And we can talk about that a bit later, but it's a fascinating subject, of this idea of why one guy, why Audie Murphy or somebody else would put their lives on the line and not care about their own life and do such extraordinary things. What motivated that? Why did they have that element of super courage, if you like, and others didn't? I found that fascinating too.
Well, these are the questions that keep people like you and I going, isn't it? Because for all the extra detail I've learned over the years about which unit was in which part of which pocket on which day, you can kind of stack up that knowledge progressively. But understanding why people do things, I'm nowhere closer now at 30 years plus of studying this than I was at the beginning. As you've stood there like I have at low tide in Omaha Beach, and you just wonder yourself, how on earth could anybody be brave enough to run up that beach? How you place yourself in a situation, you think, well, I would have turned tail and fled. I would have just dug a hole and got in it. And so these imponderable questions, the fact we can't answer them is why we keep on going, isn't it? Because you're trying to understand what these people went through. So we've talked a bit about Britt, we've talked about Murphy a little bit. Let's talk about Michael Daly as well. I think you may have mentioned him briefly a minute ago, but he's another extraordinary soldier who did extraordinary things. So give us a bit of a bio about him.
Well, he's actually one of my favorite characters from World War II. He dropped out of West Point. He didn't like the hazing, didn't agree with the sort of really intense hierarchical structure there, and ended up joining the 18th Infantry Regiment of the Big Red One. So you know exactly where they landed, Paul, on D-Day. It's Omaha Beach. He landed in the afternoon. So he was only 20 years old when he arrived on Omaha. His father was a highly decorated World War I veteran. His father actually was serving in the European theatre at the time. He came from Connecticut, Irish Catholic, and 6 foot. You can see there, almost 6'4". And he fought all the way through Normandy. Was wounded near Aachen in September of 1944, and then entered the 3rd ID during the Battle of the Colmar Pocket, and actually entered the same regiment as Audie Murphy. He came across Audie Murphy once when during training. His battalion commander was Keith Ware, who's one of the 4 main characters in my book. So he served in the 15th. 3 of the 4 main guys in the book all were in the 15th Infantry Regiment, and he fought through the Colmar Pocket. A couple of silver stars there, and then I think the only medal he didn't receive was the DSC. And then fought all the way to the end of the war. Received the medal for actions on the 17th of April 1945 in Nuremberg. He took out several machine gun nests and led his company. He was a spearhead of his company. He was a company commander by then. So you can imagine, 20-year-old guy who's in charge of 200 guys in very intense urban street fighting in Nuremberg in April 1945. And the next day, the 18th of April, that's him receiving the medal there from Truman. Actually, there were a larger number of. That's the largest number of Medal of Honor recipients ever gathered in one place at the i.e. the White House on the 23rd of August. I think there were 28 guys that received the Medal of Honor from Truman on that day. And on the 18th of April, he was shot through. Another lovely picture there of those recipients there. On the 18th of April, Daly was shot through the face by a sniper. He got to the medieval wall that surrounded the inner part of Nuremberg, and again was leading from the front. His attitude was that, he wasn't going to ask someone else to do something that he couldn't do himself, and he was nearly always at the front of his company. He was the spearhead of his company. Certainly in Nuremberg he was. And, when you get towards the end of the war, he knew very well that it would have been very, very sad indeed if some, young 18, 19-year-old guy died and didn't get to go home. So he was very much prepared to take big risks to keep his men alive and to do the things that they needed to do. And he was shot through the face by a sniper. He put his head over this medieval wall and was shot through the face and fell down on some rubble. And there was an eyewitness report I came across whereby he started to choke on his own blood, and he took up. This is the kind of guy he was, very, very cool. He pulled a pencil out of his combat jacket and stuck it down his throat, and performed a kind of primitive tracheotomy on himself to clear his windpipe. They gave him last rites. No one thought he was going to live. He was operated on, and thankfully did live. And that's a picture of him returning back home in August 1945 to his hometown in Connecticut. So yeah, he was obviously badly wounded, and struggled for several years after the war to readapt to peacetime. Drank a lot, got in a lot of fights, was arrested at one point, didn't have a clear sense of direction at all, and it took him a long time to find a meaning that was as great as he said leading men in combat in World War II. That was the most. He said he'd never been more privileged. That was the greatest period of his life, and he was proudest of that period when he led 200 guys in combat as they liberated Europe. He eventually did find an inner peace and what he called a cause greater than self, because he had realized at a very young age that the lack of ego, the willingness to give your life for somebody else, to find a cause that he believed was greater than his own self, that was greater than his own survival, was something that was so intoxicating and so powerful to him that he never forgot that. He never got over it. And he was searching for that other cause, that new cause, something greater than himself. And he found it by volunteering in a local hospital and helping veterans and devoting an awful lot of his time to helping people get over the same scars that he'd had to endure. So he gave himself to the cause of veterans and in a veterans hospital, and found a lot of satisfaction in that. You can get over, to some extent, people who've been through enormous trauma find that they can have succor and help by actually giving back to others that have been in the same situation. To them, it's a kind of classic step of recovery, long-term recovery from trauma, is to give your time and give your emotional energy to those that have had it worse or have suffered the same sort of things as you. It helps people bond, it helps them connect, and it helps them heal to a certain extent. And that was certainly the case with Daly. He healed by helping others, basically.
Well, that's an amazing story, and again, it's the idea that you're talking about their lives as a complete examination, not just their wartime experiences, because even just the stories you've shared with us, the stories aren't the same. One is immediately, Audie Murphy and Britt are very successful immediately. Daly finds a bit of a problem trying to adjust to what he's going to do post-war. Let's bring Keith Ware in now, because he's another amazing story, but because he goes on to other wars, doesn't he? So his journey takes a different direction again. So give us a bit of bio of Keith Ware.
Well, that's a great photograph there. It's not very high quality, but he's the guy furthest to my left. He's wearing the sunglasses. And so he was actually Audie Murphy's company commander on the 10th of July, 1943, when the Americans Allies first started to liberate Europe. So he was the company commander, B Company, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd ID.
Oh, we've temporarily lost Alex again. It's this happens sometimes, folks. I'll hopefully he'll come back in a bit. His internet keeps dropping out. I do hope you're enjoying the show so far. And again, I can't urge people enough to just go out there and get Alex's book, because if you haven't read any of Alex's previous works, you're missing out. The Bedford Boys is a classic. The Liberator the Spies book about the Gestapo headquarters in Paris. They're all great reads. His biography of Robert Capa. I've been privileged to know Alex for a number of years now, and other than the fact he supports Aston Villa, great historian. I was just plugging your books while you were gone there, Alex. So doing this other. So yeah. So Keith Ware was Audie Murphy's company commander. Is what we got up. We got to that point.
Yeah. Anyway, so he went all the way through the war in Europe, and actually later on received the Medal of Honor in Siegelsheim for actions on the 26th. That's him receiving the Medal of Honor in Nuremberg, where he fought. His battalion included Michael Daly. And I think that's a picture of the largest number of guys from the 3rd ID, if not any division, receiving the Medal of Honor in one place, actually on the battlefield, so to speak. And that's in the stadium, the famous Sportspalast in Nuremberg. And they're just about to blow to smithereens a big swastika eagle just above them. So much TNT that people were injured by the concrete 100 yards away. So, Ware went on to serve. He stayed in the army. He was in the occupation after the war. He's the only guy that was a draftee that became a general officer. So if you can imagine that, only once in US history has a guy that was drafted actually made it all the way to, wearing a star on their helmet. And that was Keith Ware. And he actually became the commanding officer of the Big Red One, the first ID in Vietnam, and tragically was killed in a helicopter crash. Not in Vietnam, it was in Cambodia. At the time, we didn't recognize, we were not supposed to be, I say we, but the Americans were not supposed to be in Cambodia. Yeah. Presence of Americans fighting in Cambodia was denied, but of course they were. And his helicopter was shot down by the enemy on the 3rd of September, as I say there, in 1968. So he's actually buried in Arlington, as is Audie Murphy. And last May, I went to DC and I actually visited his grave and Audie Murphy's, and they're not too far away. You can walk from one to the other pretty in not too much time. So he was a lifelong leader, and you wouldn't have thought it. One of the things about all of these guys is that none of them knew that they had leadership qualities. None of them knew before their first day in combat that they were going to be extraordinary leaders and have that fire in them and that capability. They didn't know whether they had it or not, and certainly that would have been the case if you'd seen Keith Ware on the 10th of July 1943. Quite a small guy, bespectacled. He'd been a pen pusher working at a Sears Roebuck catalog company until he was in his mid-20s. He'd never fired a shot in anger before the 10th of July 1943, but was a superb company commander. And then as he rose up the ranks to lieutenant colonel by the end of the war, had been everywhere and had performed with absolutely incredible, consummate coolness and skill. Actually, Audie Murphy saved his life in late 1944 in the Vosges Mountains. Ware and a few others at the Cleary quarry in the Vosges were pinned down by German machine gun fire, and Audie Murphy managed to save their lives in one of many acts of extraordinary courage, where he did what he thought he needed to do, and he thought that these guys shouldn't have been moving forward. They shouldn't have been risking their necks to go and see what the problem was, and let them go ahead of him, and then followed behind with a bunch of grenades, and heavily armed as he always was. He was very heavily armed, Audie Murphy, at all times, and saved his neck. So Ware and Murphy were not great friends after the war, but they did communicate. I interviewed Ware's widow, and said that Ware had a lot of affection for Murphy. And in fact, when Murphy was filming To Hell and Back, which came out in I think 1955, he asked Ware to be the technical advisor on the film, but Ware was, I think, at West Point teaching at the time and just didn't have the time to do that. But they stayed in good contact, and when Ware was killed in Cambodia, Murphy took it pretty badly. This was a guy that had been almost like a father figure to him. He was only 5-6 years older than him, but he'd looked after him. He'd been there at the very beginning in Sicily, day one, and ended the war with Ware, and had been under his command for over 300 days of very intense combat. So had an enormous amount of respect for Ware. Had managed to save his life. Had been in all the same battles, because obviously Ware was 15th Infantry and Audie Murphy was too. So there was a blood bond there, an enormous amount of respect for each other. And in fact, Ware was interviewed in 1965 by, I think it was the New York Times, when he was promoted at the Pentagon, and said that Murphy was the finest soldier he'd ever seen. And that's saying something, coming from a guy that had commanded thousands and thousands of guys and had been all the way through World War II, to single out. Ware was not a man of many words. He was very careful about what he said. He was very officious in many ways. Very didn't ramble on at any point in any time in his life, when he was in front of other guys or the press, certainly. And so for him to single out Murphy in 65 and say he was, by far the best soldier he'd ever seen, was quite some compliment. So two extraordinary guys. And one of the interesting things about the story is that, the third ID by the spring of 1945 had racked up so many medals. Britt was a star. Maurice Britt was a star back home, being celebrated as the first guy to win every medal in World War II. Third ID. Other Medal of Honor recipients had gone back to the US. The third ID had received over 30 Medal of Honors by the time you get to spring of 1945, and people noticed. The press noticed, and for a while there was certainly in the third ID Daly, third ID newspaper, which was called Frontline. They started talking about whether Murphy was going to beat Maurice Britt to becoming the most decorated guy in the division. Whether Britt had got every medal, and the only one that Murphy didn't have was the Medal of Honor. And they were comparing the two of them and their records, and literally speculating as to whether who would end up being the most decorated guy. So it wasn't so much a race, but certainly it wasn't a race to the guys at all. But certainly in the way that the press looked at it, there was certainly a kind of element of competition there. And in fact, when Murphy did receive when the notification came in late March of 1945 that Murphy would receive the medal, again there was a press report, and the headline was Murphy beats Britt. They used a sporting analogy because obviously Britt was an athlete, and they were trying to be cute and clever, and in that game, to become the most decorated, Murphy had beaten one of the great all-time greats from the University of Arkansas on a football field. So it's interesting because Murphy later on, I think it was 1968, it was the height of the Vietnam War. He said that he didn't want either of his sons to go and fight in Vietnam. He didn't agree with the war, which was a brave statement coming certainly in 1968. That was before the Tet Offensive when he made that statement. People hadn't turned against the war in America in large numbers really yet. And Murphy was pretty outspoken about it. And he said that it wasn't a war that he would want either of his sons to die in. And he was also interviewed by a guy from Esquire magazine. And he said, and he told the guy from Esquire that he wanted to see all these medals. He said, well, he'd given a lot of them to the neighborhood kids. He was living in a very nice suburb of Los Angeles, and he didn't even know where all his medals were. I think as he got further away from the war, Murphy couldn't put it behind him, but he didn't see the big deal about medals. He didn't see that a medal made you any braver than the guy. He said himself, there were so many guys that should have received the medals that I received. So many guys that were lost. That I was extraordinarily lucky. He was incredibly lucky. I mean, it was a miracle, absolute miracle. I mean, I don't believe in miracles, but if there was a miracle of World War II, it was the fact that Audie Murphy came home. There he is, very, very, very young indeed. I mean, he was 19 when he received the medal. He lied about his age to try and get into the military, and it was really only because by 1942, early 1943, the U.S. military would practically take anybody. There was like, let's just fill the ranks. He was rejected by the Marines, and weighed very little. I think he was only 5'8" tall, very, very skinny, very, very impoverished background in Texas cotton picking country in the 1930s during the Depression. Very large family. Father had abandoned the family. He knew real poverty and hunger, and like a lot of those guys, as you've come across, Paul, he was a fantastic shot. It was an extraordinarily accurate shot. And one of the reasons why he was such a good shot was because he used to hunt to put food on the table when he was a kid. And I've come across that case many times. The stories about the Fourth ID in Normandy that I've come across, where, a lot of those guys were from the South, and they were kind of disdained by some officers and some Northerners. And yet people said, the guy that you wanted in your platoon was a squirrel shooter from Arkansas or Texas, because they could fire a rifle. They could actually shoot. They could actually aim, shoot, and kill, and that was the whole point. So Murphy was and could shoot with extraordinary accuracy while moving. So, the guy was almost sprinting at a crouch, was hyper aware of the situation around him, could read the situation very, very well, had just a God-given instinct for knowing what to do at certain times, and was incredibly enterprising. And I'd say that the thing that all of these guys had in common, and I think a lot of guys that received the Medal of Honor in World War II and receive it to this day, is that they knew that they had to get a job done. When the SHIT hit the fan, someone had to do something. Someone had to take out the tank that's barreling down on your platoon or your company. Someone had to take out the machine gun nest if you were going to move forward. Someone had to do it. Very, very few people did it. Very few people had the guts and the courage to expose themselves and put their life on the line and move forward and take out the enemy, to attack and kill the enemy. It's a very small number. People think that everybody in an infantry company in World War II were, that was the job. Well, it was the job, but very few people actually did it. So one of the reasons why the Medal of Honor, any medal, is important and why they were given was to recognize that ability to be enterprising and to lead and to move into enemy fire and put your neck on the line, because that had to be rewarded. That had to be recognized and rewarded to motivate others, hopefully, to do the same. The only way that you were going to get from Sicily all the way to Nuremberg was by attacking the enemy and killing them. And so any guy that did it consistently, like Audie Murphy did, almost every day, and certainly those that did it in a way that was really impactful, where they took out a seriously important objective, people wanted to recognize that. The top brass were very keen to recognize that. There were complaints about, in July of 1944, there were complaints about the fact that the US Army was handing out too many medals. And Marshall was outraged by this. He's like, what do you mean we're handing out too many medals? It's like, out of the millions serving in uniform in World War II, you think just 434 received the Medal of Honor. That's not a lot. That's not a lot of guys, given how long the war lasted, how many people died, and how many individual acts of bravery there were. So
Yeah.
even Marshall was outraged by this idea that they were throwing DSCs and Medal of Honors away around like confetti. It was quite the opposite, I think proportionately more guys, given the number of Americans involved in World War I, received more medals than they did in World War II. In fact, the opposite was the case towards the end of the war, where there were a lot of demands from top brass to recognize more men, because they knew that in recognizing more men, that was motivational. It was a unit would feel proud. Guys would feel proud if the guy next to them who they'd seen do something extraordinary was recognized. They wanted people to be recognized because they needed to motivate these guys at the end of the war in any way they possibly could. And medals worked as motivation. Marshall believed that, Eisenhower believed it, Patton, they all believed that a medal, it wasn't just a piece of foil on your uniform. It actually made a difference. It gave people respect, it imbued honor, and it mattered a lot. And you have to remember that keeping morale, trying to keep morale going at certain points, certainly towards the end of the war, when you had very high attrition, when you're losing, January 1945 alone, 20,000 American fatalities in the European theater, when you're into this kind of mass industrial slaughter, when the war's almost over and you're trying to motivate people to take very heavily defended urban areas in Germany, they can see the door opened at the end of the corridor, the lights streaming in, and they're thinking to themselves, what the hell am I doing here? I just want to live. So you had to do everything you could to motivate anybody to get up and put their life on the line, especially towards the end of the war.
And this is the interesting thing, and thank you for that wonderful explanation, is that the medals mean something different when the war is still waging than they do when the war has come to a conclusion. Because, as you said there, for morale at the time, you're fighting your way up Italy, you're fighting your way across into Germany. It's motivating for the men around you. It's motivating for the men who are coming in to replace the ones who are being killed. But then there's that moment when the war ends, and suddenly you've got that label of being, he's the hero. He's the guy who can now do something heroic. Because as you so beautifully explained, it's that sort of spatial awareness and risk assessment that Murphy, for example, had in combat. But how do you transfer those skills necessarily to civilian life or post-war life? I mean, it's that basic. The reason human beings survive is because we've managed to adapt to every single climate on the planet. We've managed to kind of keep on being here, and it's knowing when to. I'll bring Alex 2 streams now. Hang on, Alex, but yeah, it's that knowing. People like Murphy, like Britt, these others, they know in combat that they've got to get the job done. They've got to go up there. That machine gun has to be knocked out. The enemy tank has to be taken out. The pass has to be cleared. But it's knowing when to assess when to go and when not to go. And it seems to me the people who receive the medals are the ones who have that ability in the moment to judge that risk against achievement. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say in some cases. Certainly in the case of Ware, Daly, and Murphy, they all realized that they were in a situation where a lot of guys were going to get killed, and they weren't going to get the job done unless they themselves did something. So for Ware at Siegelsheim, he knew that he had to take out very strong German resistance on the top of a hill overlooking the village of Siegelsheim, and that unless he showed the way, unless he himself became an active participant as a battalion commander, unless he actually showed the soldiers around him that how to do it and led the way, it wasn't going to get done. The job wasn't going to get done. So there were many cases where guys did it because they knew that they were guys around them, or they would be killed unless someone did something. And then there were many cases where people literally just went berserk and hadn't had enough. They snapped. They were so under pressure. They were so angry. They'd seen friends killed. The adrenaline was pumping so high that they just went, what the hell? I don't care. Just get it done. They used to have a term for that often in World War II, which was called gun crazy. Guys would go gun crazy. They just lose the plot and just go berserk, and that in many cases ended up earning them death, or death and the Medal of Honor posthumously, but also the Medal of Honor. There were many cases where guys just broke, they snapped enough, and they're like, I'm not going to be stuck here watching all these buddies get ill. Someone's got to do something. I'm going to do it. And in some cases, they just carried on doing it until they were riddled with bullets or they were killed. They didn't go crazy in that sense, but they did. They just couldn't. They lived in the moment, and they did whatever they thought they could to destroy the enemy. And some of them survived, and some of them just kept on fighting until they were killed. There were many cases I came across where they just didn't stop. It was like they just, once they got started, once the motor started revving, they just didn't stop. They just carried on until they were killed. They kept running. They kept taking out machine gun nests. They kept fighting even though they were wounded. Many cases where you'll see that they were actually fatally wounded because they didn't stop. I mean, they just literally could have just, dived to the ground, gone, okay, I've done a hell of a lot today. I've done my shift. I'm going to stop, and they just didn't stop. So there was something in them where they just literally didn't have a break. It was like, I'm in combat. I'm going to carry on until I've killed or taken out as many Germans as possible, and there was no break. So that happened over and over and over and over again, where guys just literally went gone crazy and couldn't stop.
Yeah. So I know you've just said that the cases are different and you can't judge them all the same, but with the books you've written, including this one, is there maybe some kind of medal earning gene? Is there some particular quality? I mean, you've obviously said that sometimes it's anger, sometimes it's very good, they're good marksmen, they're good shots, but is there something that you can put on them that you can say they've all got some unique quality? Resilience, tenacity, is there one thing you can think of?
I'd say that they were all selfless.
Right.
Their egos didn't matter in the moment. They were surprisingly calm under stress. They definitely had a very very well developed sense of resilience that they might not even have realized they had until they were put at the sharp end. But they had a sense of duty and honor, and the knowledge that they had to do something, and they had to protect and save the men around them by doing something. And often these guys had an inner rage and an anger. They had tough lives. They were aggressive, and very aggressive. I don't think anybody that receives the Medal of Honor could not be described as aggressive. You have to be aggressive. So war brought out a calmness, a resilience, and an aggression, and a willingness to be able to expose themselves to possible death that very few people have or had.
Yeah.
There's one statistic I came across in Normandy, where even in a firefight, and you probably know about this, Paul, even in a firefight when Americans were being shot at, less than a third of guys in a rifle company or a platoon would actually fire back, even when they were being fired at. So
they say,
Very few people wanted to expose themselves. Very few people wanted to get out of that foxhole and run at the enemy, and very few people wanted to end up killing themselves by doing the right thing. And it's a very rare thing that you find in combat. It's a very rare and precious thing. And I think, to sum up in terms of the Medal of Honor, the reason why it's so important, and it has been through history, is because it rewards those very rare individuals who are exactly who you need to win a war, certainly on the ground or in any other in the air or on water, but certainly boots on the ground. You need those extraordinary individuals, and they should be recognized. You don't win a war unless you have those guys who'll do the hard work and the hard fighting and have the aggression to move forward and take out the enemy. So in a way, by writing about the 3rd Division and all these guys in the 3rd Division, what I was trying to really paint a picture of was that enormous courage and resilience throughout the European campaign, but also to point out that when it came down to the sharp end, when it really mattered, yes, you've got artillery, yes, you've got all the means of trying to break down the enemy, etc. But you still need guys to get out of trenches, get out of foxholes, and do the job. And there were not many of them. And there were not many people in the front line in fighting World War II anyway. A very small percentage of the 16 million Americans that wore uniform actually saw the dirty end of it. And even at that sharp end, there were very few that actually could lead effectively by showing the way and being extremely aggressive and very courageous.
No, brilliantly explained. And ironically, the quality, the first quality you singled out there, the selflessness, I think is really fascinating, because by being selfless, they end up receiving the individual decoration. There's a sort of a paradox there, that by showing a quality of caring about others, you end up being rewarded individually. It's an odd situation that we are now remembering people as an individual, but actually what set them apart was that they were thinking about the group. That's an interesting kind of thought to leave it on, really. But as we had intermittent internet problems, with all, each time you've got a book about to hit the market, you've got different hopes, different aspirations. Sometimes you're highlighting a unit, a campaign. I know, because you said it earlier, you're interested in that kind of late war, spring 45 period, Colmar Pocket, the Vosges, because it doesn't get the press of the Normandy campaign or the Ardennes. It's interesting what you said earlier about how in the news the Third ID were in 1943, and they were all over. That's when the medals are making the headlines, until June the 6th, 44 happened, and suddenly what was happening in the Italian theatre just becomes 2nd or 3rd page news, and D-Day now becomes 1st page news. But to bring it to the question I was going to ask, what are your hopes with this book? Obviously, you're highlighting these individual stories, but is it to kind of examine what it is that, as you said there, makes some people heroes, quote unquote?
Yeah, I think it is, and it's also, kind of like, yet again, I don't say that in a light way, but it's also to basically remind people of what those, here's a division that arguably gave most, that had very high casualties and spent longer fighting to liberate Europe than any other American division in World War II. So in a way, I'm always trying to remind people of that sacrifice and how important it is to remember it, because if you look at the situation in Europe right now, we're suddenly very aware of how important the Western alliance is. We're suddenly hyper aware of what the importance of democracy and self-determination. And we're shocked and stunned by the fact that there's such a brutal war on the border of Europe, that history threatens to repeat itself. And I think that in every book that I've written and will continue to write, I just want to remind people that what they did gave us so much that we have taken so for granted. We haven't defended ourselves properly. We haven't dealt with the threat of people like Putin properly. We've coasted for decades, and we've been allowed to do that because we've had a peaceful and united Europe. That the longest period in European history, that achievement was enormous, and now it looks even more enormous, because those guys gave their lives. 138,000, I think, Americans in the European theatre, many more Brits, etc., etc. But they gave themselves their lives enjoyed, which is peace and democracy and a relatively united Europe for so long. They gave everything so that we could enjoy democracy. And for so long, people have been saying things like freedom isn't free, democracy matters, and every time you listen to a World War II veteran talking about why the loss of their buddies in Europe and on Omaha Beach, etc., why it was so important, people could have stopped listening. They'd be like, "Oh, I've heard that 1,000 times. I've heard it millions of times." Just go banging on about World War II and how important it is, the lessons we need to teach about it, etc. People are not saying that anymore. They're not thinking that anymore, because they realize that democracy, civilization, all the things that we find beautiful and meaningful in life, those are disappearing as I speak in the Ukraine right now. There are 34 democracies left in the world, just 34, and we're losing one as I speak right now. So the book is about the liberation of Europe, and it's about the most beautiful sacrifice in recent history, certainly if you're American, because they bought us so much that we now are worried about losing. It's a reminder of what it took. It took enormous courage, enormous sacrifice, and guys like Michael Daly, Keith Ware, Maurice, Britt, Audie Murphy, etc. It took guys like that to give us what we've been blessed with, and what now suddenly we realize we have to savor and cherish and defend properly.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end on that note there. And thanks for giving me a bit of a personal boost, because I've been feeling since this horrific war began, is it appropriate to still keep hosting this channel and talking about, you know, Panther tanks and Spitfires and battles? You know, I've had pangs of guilt, like I have as a tour guide over the years. You know, making money out of other people's suffering is kind of how I've, in my worst moments, I've thought about it. But when what you're saying there about what this generation did, it's given me that boost that talking about these events can't be possibly be hurting. It can only be helping, I would think, to remind us all of what democracy is and what sacrifice is. So you're giving me a bit of a boost in the arm that perhaps talking about World War II isn't a bad thing at the moment.
Well, we should always remember that what they fought for is on the line, and we owe it to them to protect what they gave us. We owe it to them. Yeah. That's the least we can do, is to protect the beautiful heritage that they gave us, all the blessings that they gave us. We need to remember that, and we need to be inspired by their example and see from the darkest times in World War II how human resilience can prevail, and how we're basically a decent species and we can overcome incredible misfortune. We just need to remember them as inspirational figures, and I think they would, all the guys that I've known that have passed away, they would be delighted to think that we use them as inspirational examples, and that we remember them constantly, and remember just how special the gift was that they gave us, which was freedom and democracy.
Well, brilliant. Well, we will end it on that. While we've still got an internet connection, we'll end it on that. So I'll just remind people what we've got coming up, and I'll come back and say goodbye in a second. So, folks, Naval Battles Week starts tomorrow on World War II TV. As again, I remind you once again, the link to Alex's books are in the description below, and go out there and get the whole library because they're fantastic. I have a little Alex Kershaw half shelf. I think he's next to John McManus, and I think maybe James Hall on the other side. I can't remember where he is. I keep moving my books around because I keep getting new ones, and it's a constant struggle to find where they are these days. But anyway, with that, I'm going to just say thank you very much, Alex. And it's always a pleasure speaking to you. And I can't wait for us to meet up again in Normandy, and whether it'll be standing on Omaha Beach or in a hotel lobby in Bayeux, I can't wait to raise a beer with you. It'll be really good to see some of my friends from across Atlantic again after these 2 years of travel difficulties. So the first round is on me, Alex.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties, but it was a great interview and a great honor and pleasure to be with you again. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. So, folks, this is Paul Willett for World War II TV saying I'll see you all again tomorrow. I'm off to go and watch the BAFTAs. Cheers, everybody. Bye.